Hello friends of Crawford, it's me, Michael Waldron, and I'm really delighted to be able to show you around our exhibition Statio Bene, Art in Ireland's Maritime Haven. So the exhibition itself is drawn from the collection, and we have a really rich array of historic and contemporary artworks that I suppose meditate on the views of the harbour, but also the traditions of the southwest of Ireland in terms of its maritime history, but also that very specific heritage of what it is to be a safe harbour. So it is, I suppose, no surprise that Cork Harbour has a very long history and a very storied history. So it stretches back millennia, and we have had, I suppose, Cork Harbour as a site of arrivals for many centuries, but also of departures. So why is Cork Harbour so important? Well, first of all, it is one of the largest natural navigable harbours in the world, second only apparently to Sydney, Australia. And we also have, I suppose, a long history of maritime trade with not only the south of England, but also with the Dutch Republic and further afield across the world to the West Indies and so on. This particular image is a print from about 1789 or 1790, and it is by the artist Thomas Sowtell Roberts, who was the younger brother of Thomas Roberts, the Waterford painter. And it gives us a clue as to just how vast Cork Harbour was from the city outwards. So we have a vantage point here, probably kind of higher ground than Sunday's Well, perhaps the top of Blarney Street. And it looks downriver into the city, here in the foreground or the middle ground, with old St. Patrick's Bridge. And then out into this wide basin, which might not be recognisable today, but a clue can be found in the middle of the picture. This long, narrow strip is called the Navigation Wall, which is today's marina. And so all of the area south of it was marshland, which would flood in high tide, but at low tide was essentially slob. And so that was reclaimed with the railways in the 1840s. So our river today and that large harbour area has, I suppose, been restricted, but it still shows this wonderful unfolding of the harbour as it goes from the port of Cork all the way down to Great Island and out to the sea. So this painting dates to about 1809, so about 20 years after the view by Thomas Sowtell Roberts. But our vantage point is very different. Here we think it's taken from Rostellan, so that's in the lower harbour, as it looks across the wide basin of Cork Harbour. We're not quite sure what we're looking at. Some people think that over here we have Great Island, others think it's Currabinny. This looks to be Rocky Island, a small island which is now home to the crematorium, but in those days was a naval barracks. And here we have a sort of an island that might be actually Inishbeg, which is where the oil refinery is today. So it's hard to really follow where we're looking from. But what is really interesting is that around this time, artists were sort of inventing landscapes. So it might actually be a sort of a bringing together of aspects of the harbour to give a pleasing view. And in this case, the expanse of the harbour is important. And if it is Rostellan, then it perhaps was a commission from a wealthy landowner on that side of the harbour. But just how big is Cork Harbour? Well, apparently it's 70 square kilometres, which seems extraordinary. But when we take into account all of the different arms of the harbour, which reveal themselves, as some historians have said, not as a big open space, but you round a bend and it opens again and again. So from the port of Cork down the main channel of the River Lee, we open into Loch Mahon, And then, of course, all of the water that surrounds the islands of the harbour, from Little Island and Great Island to Fota and Spike, and so on. So here we have just a hint of that feeling of what it is to be in this expansive harbour, and of course the leisure that comes with it. Although captioned as 1724, the same year that this room that I'm standing in was built as part of the Custom House of Cork, the image itself dates to about 1842, and it's by John Fitzgerald, who was self-proclaimed Bard of the Lee, and as the Bard of the Lee, of course, the river and the harbour are his subject. So in this instance, we are really focused on a very particular and recognisable part of the built heritage of our harbour, and that, of course, is Blackrock Castle. Now, it doesn't fully resemble the Blackrock Castle we have today. It is an older version of it, and perhaps the domed roof is what gave more contemporary people the idea of turning it into an observatory. But if we go back into the past, this, of course, was one of the last lines of defence in the harbour. So if you have a safe harbour, and remember that the motto of Cork is Statio Bene, Fida Carinas, which means a safe harbour for ships, then perhaps this is part of that ensuring that protection and safety. So Blackrock Castle had that defensive capacity, although it was never really tested. What is really interesting about this image, though, is that we have some vessels coming up the river, and they are returning from a very particular event. Now, it is satirically treated, so there's quite a bit of humour and comedy in this, and a lot of visual interest. But the people in these vessels are the Lord Mayor and the Aldermen of Cork, and they are returning from the throwing of the dart, which is an annual tradition undertaken by each Lord Mayor to this day, which I suppose asserts their role as Admiral of the harbour. So the harbour and the city are united in this tradition, and the tradition stretches back hundreds and hundreds of years. So when we have a safe harbour that is protected by coastal defences and forts, what do we do with it? Well, of course, a safe harbour in a strategic location on transatlantic shipping lanes means potential prosperity. And of course, Cork Harbour itself used to garrison the British Army and Navy, but also used to provision it with particularly dairy products. And so Cork was the largest exporter of butter in the world at one time. So it's no surprise that this very, very, I think, iconic painting of Cork Harbour should indicate some of that busyness and prosperity. We have a city from 1842, and this painting is by George Mounsey Wheatley Atkinson. We have the Port of Cork, Old City Hall, which was burned in 1920, the spire of Old St. Finbarr's, which was replaced in the 1860s. And then we have Penrose House, which still stands today, also Shandon and St. Patrick's Church. So we have recognisable locations that locate us, essentially in the middle of the River Lee as it breaks into its north and south channels. But what's really interesting about this, I think, is all of the masts of the ships on both channels of the river that suggest that maritime trade and movement by water is the chief, I suppose, the chief focus of this port. And what's more, we have the changing of the guard. So almost like Turner's The Fighting Temeraire, we have, I suppose, the old guard, which is represented by masted sailing vessels, being replaced with steam power. And in this case, we have a steam vessel, very reminiscent of the Sirius, which is probably on a return journey from Bristol or Liverpool in this case. So we have a really rich scene here, but it is a scene of welcome. A beautiful sunset, I suppose, colours this city in warm tones and welcomes the returning traveller or the new migrant. So these three gorgeous sketches are very, very rare. They were made in October 1819 by the British artist Sarah Grace Carr. And what they tell us is something very, very interesting. On her travels through Wales and Ireland, Sarah Grace Carr visited Cork. She probably arrived by sea, of course, because this is before the railway, and land travel probably wasn't as, I suppose, comfortable or even efficient. And so her first impression of Cork would have been by water, arriving in through the mouth of the harbour at Roche's Point, Camden and Carlisle, and in towards Cove Town itself. And so we have here three views of the harbour, but this stretch of the harbour. The first one is taken from a vantage point of Cove, looking towards Haulbowline and Rocky Island. And it tells you, I suppose, of the naval history of the harbour, where you have various sizes of naval frigate and smaller vessels, maybe sloops and so on, and some activity in the foreground, people either disembarking a vessel or boarding. We also have the Martello Towers that are at Haulbowline and Ringaskiddy, again reminding us of how this is a garrisoned and defended port. It might even remind us of the treaty ports in the 20th century. Further down then, here and here, we have the Lower Glanmire Road and the vessels that crowd the channel of the Lee as it approaches the city. And then here we have the busy Patrick's Quay and Merchant's Quay. So a real source of the prosperity of the city, the international trade, and the things that sustained the city. This is the city of the merchant princes, the Penroses, the Beamishes, the Crawfords, but also it is a city that is very much connected with the world. It is outward looking, and it is a melting pot of civilization and culture. So there's always an exception to the rule, and I'm cheating here a little bit. We've included a really gorgeous grisaille painting, so a grey monochrome painting, by the Dutch artist Willem Vanderbilt. He was a 17th century marine painter and draftsman. And we've included this because it I suppose, speaks to the international dimension, not only of our collection, but also that maritime trade that connected Ireland with elsewhere. In this case, Willem Vanderbilt depicts Dutch vessels. So, of course, the Netherlands and the Dutch Republic was a great trading power and an international power in the 17th century. If we think of the Dutch East India Company and the Dutch West India Company, we might have some, I suppose, suggestion of their impact on the world, which was, of course, colonial and commercial. Here we have three recognisable vessels. This is called a cag, which is a passenger vessel, and it has these very distinctive lee boards, which are sort of used for shallow water navigation. Here we have another vessel called the Staat and Yacht, which would be a state yacht or state vessel for transporting dignitaries. And those eagle-eyed among you and aficionados of flags might be able to pick out who might be on this vessel or what it represents. And then further out we have a pinnace, which is a sort of a Dutch frigate, which was for protection. So this is kind of a convoy of vessels, probably in the waters of the North Sea or maybe the English Channel. Some of these would have visited Cork, and that Dutch connection is very important. If we think of the Maardyk in the city, which was laid out in the early 18th century, that comes from the Dutch word meerdijk, which is a raised dike that keeps the water away from a floodplain. Equally, the building that I'm standing in, the Custom House of Cork, was designed by Claude Leuventin, and he was a Dutch architect. Equally, even more recent, the extension that was added to the building in 2000 was designed by Eric van Egeraat, another Dutch architect. Many of the buildings of Cork used Dutch brick, which was used as ballast in ocean-going vessels, and of course some distinctive tall buildings, tall gabled buildings called Dutch billies, still exist in the city. So this, I suppose, stands in for that deep connection with international trade between Cork and the Dutch Republic. While we've spoken a lot about the harbour itself and vessels and kind of the maritime history, I'd like to now maybe turn our attention to people. You know, who are the people who travel to harbours or between harbours? We've already met Sarah Grace Carr, who did this wonderful sketches, and she visited Cork and its environs in 1819. Equally, the two portraits behind me speak of a kind of a rich tradition of Cork people going out into the world, and of course people of the world coming to Cork. First of all, the man behind me in wonderful army attire in his uniform is James Roche Verling. He was a physician from Cork who was part of the British Army in the early 19th century, and at one time he was stationed on the island of St. Helena. Now, St. Helena is a very, very distant rock in the South Atlantic and a British Dominion territory. And at the time of his stationing on St. Helena, it was also the site of exile for the Emperor Napoleon. And James Roche Verling was very, very briefly his physician. Napoleon didn't like him and thought he was spying on him. Verling then returned eventually to Cove, where he retired. But it is really interesting to think of him going out into the world as an Irishman and experiencing and, I suppose, coming into contact with the great personages of the time. Equally, the portrait over here, the man in the red coat, is the governor of St. Helena a little bit earlier in the late 18th century. And his name is John Scotto. Now, he was not a native of Cork, and he has very little connection with Cork, except that his daughter, who was born on the island of St. Helena, eventually moved to Cork for her marriage, and she eventually settled in Passage West. And it is her son who painted this portrait of his grandfather. So there is a kind of an interesting tangential connection between St. Helena and Cork, just to underscore, I suppose, again, how Ireland was part, at the time in the 19th century, of a global machine, which was the British Empire. The two images behind me speak of, I suppose, a really, really specific part of Cork Harbour's history, and that, of course, is its sailing history. Not necessarily commercial, but that of leisure. So the top image here is of Crosshaven, and the lower image is of Cove. Now, for 300 years, the Royal Cork Yacht Club has been in existence. It is thought to be the oldest established yacht club in the world. It was founded initially in 1720 on Haulbowline Island, now the home of the Irish Naval Service, as the Cork Water Club. And it was, I suppose, frequented and patronised by some of the leading families of Cork, including the Smith Barrys of Fota and latterly the Penroses and others. But what is really interesting about these two images is that it transports us through the history of that yacht club, from Cove, where it was in the 19th century, and particularly this building, which is now Serious Art Centre, through to Crosshaven and into Drake's Pool, which is itself a very storied place. The painting behind me is by Norah McGuinness, and it depicts New York Harbour around 1945. So if we think of this at kind of almost the culmination of the Second World War, this is the modern metropolis of skyscrapers, very different from Cork and Cork Harbour, but of course connected for generations through transatlantic trade and transatlantic migration. I suppose it's very important to think of Cork Harbour in relation to migration, not only people coming in, but also people going out. It is thought that about 1 million people departed Cork Harbour during the famine years, and that sadness, but also that necessity, must always remain in our mind when we think of the harbour, not only as a place of safety, but also a place that people must depart from, and perhaps take their lives into their own hands for some time. So we near the end of this little tour of Statio Bene, but before we depart, I'd like to spend a little bit of time on this grid of 16 images behind me. They come from a series called Albert, Ernest and the Titanic, which were made in 2012 to celebrate the centenary of that ill-fated ocean liner. They are the work of Jamie Murphy, a contemporary printmaker. And what is extraordinary about this is that some of the ink used in this series is derived from coal salvaged from the Titanic wreck in the North Atlantic. So in this series is embodied a part of that vessel that in April 1912 had its last port of call in Cork, specifically in the outer harbour within visibility of Roche's Point. And so we follow the progress of the ship from the top all the way down to the bottom here. As it leaves Belfast Lough, goes to Southampton, Cherbourg and Queenstown as it was then, and then out along the Irish coast, past Ireland's Teardrop and Fastnet, and out into the Atlantic, where of course we know where the story ends. This is a really wonderful series as well, of 40 images, so we've only selected 16. And that tells the story of the printmakers who were on board that vessel making the stationery. We even have images of the Marconi machine and, of course, the sinking of the vessel itself. And the iceberg does feature. So rather than leaving you with that sinking feeling, pardon the pun, I'd like to thank you so much for joining me on this tour of Statio Bene, Art in Ireland's Maritime Haven, which runs till April next year. So perhaps we'll get a chance to visit it in person. But I'd like to leave you with maybe the more uplifting words of the poet Paula Meehan, who wrote last year, "May fixed stars guide you until you reach safe harbour, a place to call home."